Welcome back to another episode of Investing Explained. Here's today's question. Definitely not too old to become a value investor. I don't think you can be too old to start investing. But I do think you have lost some, but far from all of your most valuable asset, namely time to accumulate and compound your net worth. Therefore, if you do plan to retire within the next 10 years, I don't think value investing is the right way to do it. At least if you don't have any meaningful savings, it's going to be very hard to retire. But you can say that about any investing strategy, really. You might already have done some of the math and said that with what you can put aside every month over the next 10 years and compound it, for instance, 6, 8, or 10%, or whatever kind of percentages you use annually for your portfolio, you just won't get to that amount where you can retire. So now you have multiple options. For instance, you can say that since you can't retire, it's not worth investing anyway, which would be a horrible decision to make for obvious reasons. You might also have done some of the math and think, well, I probably just need to take bigger risks and I need to speculate. But not really to bet against you, but the most likely result of that decision is that you will lose all of your money. And have the mindset of you'll need to make it or break it within 5 or 10 years, it's going to be so hard because it requires a lot of luck, but also specialized knowledge. It could be starting your own scalable company. But if you plan to focus on listed security, which is what most value investors are probably thinking about doing, again, depending on how much you can invest, you probably need something like 50% annual return, perhaps even more, which is close to being impossible. And it will require so much leverage and risk-taking for you in the time to come that it would basically be the same as going down to the local casino and play the roulette. So my best piece of advice for you would be continue with value investing. And while you won't likely retire the next 10 years, if you do make sound decisions, not only will you have compounding net worth and on your way to retire eventually, but while you wait for that, your nest egg can provide you with many advantages. It might be you can now afford to take a lower paying job that you're more passionate about, or working few hours at your current job. And then really to your other question about you meeting up with your girlfriends and talking about investing over a glass of wine, which sounds like an absolutely amazing idea. If you do that, I probably wouldn't start at all with value investing and not go into detail with stock investing in the very beginning. I think for the first few meetings, simply focus on getting the right mindset for the group. For you having read Preston's book and for you to listen to our podcast, you already have the mindset of an investor. And the next step for you is to start investing, as you also mentioned there in your question. But I really don't think you should jump the gun with your friends. And I'm likely the worst salesperson in the world whenever I say this, but perhaps you shouldn't ask them to listen to our podcast, or you shouldn't ask them to read our investing books, or investing books in general. I think it starts before that, and you need to help your friends getting the right mindset about personal finance before they can think about investing. For instance, a very easy and approachable book to start reading, and it will just take your friends an afternoon to go through it, would be Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And just be warned, the Rich Dad that Robert Kiyosaki, the author, is referring to, he doesn't really exist, and he unfortunately fails to mention that. But the key takeaways from that book would just really change the way you think about money. If you read it together with your friends, you have the same reference point and learn the very basics of an investing mindset in probably one of the most approachable books you can find out there. And there'll just be some pointers that would just be so helpful for your friends in the states that they're in. Having money work for you instead of working for money. It's a concept that I guess for most listeners listen to this podcast is very basic, but most people don't think that way. By reading the book, you also get the mindset of thinking about tax, which you also mentioned there in your question. For instance, when or should you set up an LLC for tax reasons? Another thing would be something like a house doesn't have to be an asset. It can be. For instance, rental property that you own would be an asset. But I would imagine that perhaps you and your friends might be paying down on a mortgage and use that equity as your pension. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you also need to understand the shortcomings of that strategy. And you best do that by thinking like an investor. So again, if you focus on discounted cash flows, specific and value investing, or anything like that, you'll lose your friends before you even get started. Have the mindset first about investing, and then talk and think about which types of assets are right for you and why. You cannot do it the other way around.
So I'd like to tell you, just like Stig, it's never too late to apply the lessons of proper asset valuation. Whether it's too late or not really isn't an important question, because I would argue that it's more about making the transition to simply use the methodology and the thought process as soon as you can. When a person approaches the ownership of any investment, whether it's operational or non-operationally owned, through the lens of profits and price, everything seems to be managed much more appropriately. So what I would tell you for your meetup with your friends is a little bit different advice than Stig, and maybe you can kind of combine both of them there, is a puzzle that I like to always ask people who I know are just getting into value investing and finance. And the riddle or the puzzle kind of goes like this. Ask them what they would do if they could buy a money machine. Say, I have a money machine, I would sell it to you, and it produces, it prints money, and even though it is forgery or forged money, you can actually spend this money that the money machine produces. So ask them, how much are you willing to buy that money machine for? And just listen to the responses, and you'll get some really colorful responses. Some people would say, well, I'd pay anything for that. And you get some people that say, I'd pay $1 million for that. But what you're really looking for in this interaction with people is you're trying to get at the root of price compared to profit or dividends that are being produced. So when a person says, well, I don't know what I would pay, the next question you need to bring to them is, well, you should be asking me, how much money does the machine print annually? Each year, how much does that money machine produce? And so then give them a really small number. Say, well, the money machine produces $1,000 a year. That's all the more it can print. That's just the speed that the money machine produces, and you can't make it go any faster. And then the conversation becomes much more interesting when you frame it that way, because now they've got to make a decision as to how much money they're willing to pay for something that only produces $1,000 a year. So when you compare this to stock investing, you can see how there's a correlation here by looking at the earnings per share that a stock is producing. So you can name companies like Google or Amazon, these companies that have just enormous brand power that would be viewed the same way as like a money machine in many people's eyes. And what it forces people to do is they have to step back from the qualitative features of hearing money machine, and now they have to do a little bit of mathematics behind the discussion. So for the example of a money machine that can print $1,000 a year, if you're going to pay, let's just say you're going to pay $100,000 for that money machine. Well, now you know you're only making a 1% return by paying $100,000 for something that only makes $1,000 a year. And that's where the conversation really becomes a lot of fun, and people can then, and you can immediately make the translation and the jump to stock investing with your friends. So I would propose something fun like that to really kind of capture their interest, and then combine that with a book recommendation, kind of like what Stig provided. And I think it can really kind of get people excited, and it generates a really fun conversation.
That's it. Preston and I will continue explaining investing, so go ahead and hit that subscribe button.